Great. So without much further ado, I'm going to pass straight over to Rinkoo and welcome him to this digital stage we have. Over to you, Rinkoo.
Thanks, Paul. Hi, everyone. Thank you. Hi, all. I'm really looking forward to being with you today, and I hope you're all happy. It's Friday, so that's one good reason to be cheerful on a Friday. Cool. So yeah, I'm here to talk to you guys a bit about accessibility, particularly when it comes to deaf and also hard of hearing audience members. So it might be best if I kind of run you through a bit of my personal experience. I don't know about other deaf members of the community. They may have different perspectives from me. It's kind of key to remember that everybody has different preferences. But if I tell you about my personal experience, then I know that's true to myself. So thinking about opportunities to go to the theatre, back in the old days, I'd say there weren't really maybe any captioned performances or interpreted performances. To be honest, I don't know how much was available because I probably didn't really look, but I think there was not. It was pretty limited, and even now it's pretty limited to find performances that are interpreted or captioned. When you do search around, you do tend to find them. But the way you know and you can find out what's available is difficult to know, as that's probably the first stumbling block, that people don't know in the first place how they can find out about performances that are accessible. So I don't know, if you want to go to the cinema, fancy watching a film, if you go on Google and type whatever film it is, they'll say the latest available showing is blah, 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 blah. But then it doesn't necessarily say whether it's accessible to deaf or hard of hearing people. So you have to then go to each cinema, each theatre company, if it's the theatre that you want to go to, and contact them and find out, have you got this availability? And if they do, if so, when is it? And it might be, that's unfortunately, you've got it, but it's on a date that I can't make. So this is the first kind of major stumbling block, I'd say, into a deaf and hard of hearing audiences actually even getting to the theatre. And I'd say in my experience, yeah, I'm mainly predominantly talking about sign language accessible performances. And when theatres tend to book interpreters to stand on the side of the stage, depending on what the performance is, usually the interpreter there always has to stand on the right of stage or far left of stage. In my experience, which means when I do go to the theatre and there's an interpreter there, you're actually craning your neck so far to either side of the stage that you're not really enjoying the performance, because it's hard to flick between the two. So you're missing out on kind of the emotion, the performance that the artists are giving, really. And I've always felt a little bit dissatisfied coming out of a theatre after watching an interpreted performance when you've got the interpreter on the side of the stage. So it's trying to think how a deaf member of the audience could feel that they're getting the same out of a performance. They're getting the tone, the emotion, the story, the performance that the artist is portraying. It's really, really difficult. And if you think about a performance, there are lots of characters going on, and that one single interpreter has to try and relay or portray all of those different characters. It's difficult. That's quite a huge task for an interpreter to try and differentiate between each character and make it really distinct and clear, so that the deaf audience member can follow along and know exactly what's happening in the story. And I don't mean to sound critical of interpreters, but there's something kind of missing in that. There's some elements that get missed in that interpretation. It's hard to put your finger on what it is, but I think after thinking about it, it's just having one single interpreter interpreting a whole entire play. If you really think about that, it's not practical, is it? It's really not going to work. They do a good job trying, but it's just not 100% perfect, and you're just not getting the same as a hearing member of the audience would. So I've personally, as an artist, I've kind of done I've done my one-man show, and I do actually portray 58 different characters in that 1 hour show, and so I've got the experience of doing that. I know it can be done. You go through the range of emotions and to show those different characters, so that can be done from that way. But going to watch an interpreter performance with one single interpreter on the stage, I'm always left feeling a bit disappointed, because it's such a huge task for that interpreter to try and get across all those different characters, and for you as a deaf member of the audience to really get the same experience. So it would be much more freeing for me if I could just do without the interpreter and somehow be able to access a performance. That would be my dream. I don't know how I could make that a reality, but I think it's difficult. I don't get to go to the theatre as much as I want to. I've got commitments, and you do have to rely on interpreters in my situation. The first thing I kind of do as I get up in the morning is watch an interpreter, and then all day at work I've got interpreters, and then in the evening, if I think, right, I want to go see a show, but I've got to sit there and watch an interpreter, this is just me. And as I said, I reiterate what I said at the beginning, it's my personal preference, but I just think I can't be doing with just watching another interpreter, because I'm not watching the play, I'm watching the interpreter. So yeah, I think we're going to swap interpreters just there, so we'll pause a sec.
Thank you, Danielle. Okay, we've got a new fresh face on the go now, Rinkoo saying. So that's kind of my view, my take on it. And there are issues within that area. I mean, it's fantastic to have that interpreter provision for accessibility within a theatre. I think it's fantastic to have, because you're trying to bring in deaf people, giving them that access to watch the content and to enjoy themselves. That is a good thing. It's the right step forward, but there are still that reliance on the one interpreter to portray so many different characters. You know, how can that situation be improved? That's what we need to look into. Maybe we need 5 or 10 interpreters to portray each individual character. You know, would that work? Is it overkill? You know, obviously the cost implication as well, we are expensive. You have to think about how obviously we can improve the situation in terms of accessibility. I've thought about it, and there's nothing that I think really comes to mind for me. I think it's best to put deaf actors kind of at the forefront, immersed in the play, so that we feel that kind of parity, we feel that we are included like a mainstream audience would. And we obviously we all live in the same world. There's one world. We can't, you know, there's not two worlds. There's no divide, there's no separation. We have to work together. That's paramount. You know, you can't, if I'm looking at a separate interpreter, I feel kind of detracted from the whole thing. And that's my view. Again, I need to reinforce that. Secondly, we're talking about sign language. You know, there's different forms of the language itself. If you get what I'm saying, I know most hearing people, they themselves, you know, they think, oh, sign language is kind of generic. It's universal. It's the same everywhere. It's not. There's vast differences. An example would be, obviously, we've got American Sign Language, we've got Japanese Sign Language, we've got British Sign Language. Each one has their own kind of syntax, contextualization, like the way it's used. But obviously here within the UK, we do also have kind of, to the next extreme, regional variations of British Sign Language. We've got the London region, Birmingham, Manchester, all across the UK. We, as a deaf community, can tell the differences. We can, if someone uses a certain vocab, we know you're kind of from this area in the UK or thereabouts. And then the problem with that is, in terms of an interpreter translating, it's difficult for them because they need to translate so that everyone can kind of understand that parity again. And it's difficult when you've got people from all over the UK in the audience. You know, maybe you might think I'm a bit fussy, but, you know, theatre is about that kind of in-depth, emotive content. So, that's one thing that I find I take issue with. I remember once I went somewhere to a place and the girl went to start singing and making the assumption that an interpreter would come on stage. And I'm like, So they're bringing out break dancers as well with black boys that were doing break dancing on stage as they were. And I was like, oh, hold on, get the interpreter off here, and then crack on, show me what you can do. And then the boys were, obviously, I think it was their first time obviously listening to the music and then trying to express that in their own form of dance, break dancing. So they'd hear the kind of the audio content, and then I'd just watch that. And I understood that. I understood the story visually because it's how they interpreted song and expressed it in dance, and that's another form of translation, really. It doesn't have to be the literal form where we're relying on kind of British Sign Language coming from English. That's just one example, one tool, something that we can pull out of the bag, like breakdancing. Why not? So it made me then realize we've got plenty of options, really, lots of avenues to consider. And the most important being that the audience understand what's being portrayed. But the big issue is we, as the deaf community, kind of the mindset that we have as a community is that we have that reliance on British Sign Language only. But no, it doesn't need to be as constricting as that. We can try and understand kind of language in a variety of ways, like that example, dancing. The physical kind of movement, story that it depicts. They all have kind of familiar vibes to sign language where we can kind of recognize the content. Some of deaf won't understand, of course. So that's the challenge that we're experiencing at the moment. And it means that it's obviously less of an eyesore, really, as well. I'm going to work, like I said, I watch an interpreter from 9 to 5, one person all day, the same face, and it can be quite draining. And then I'm going to a place of where I want to get some pleasure, and I'm watching an interpreter for however long there as well. And it is an eyesore. And I think that theatre kind of dynamic needs to be adapted so that we can enjoy ourselves and that we can learn what it is our hearing counterparts would learn as well. Like, oh, wow, that was amazing. What I really took from that. That, again, my personal view, I'd love to change the structure of how that's set up. Number 3, captioning. So we as a deaf community, we rely on captioning through like kind of television, watching films, any sort of kind of media, subtitling, and then the theatre finally instilled captioning, which I think is fantastic. Hats off to them. But there are obviously people within the theatre that have decided where they put the captioning. It can be up there, and the play's there, up there. I'm missing what's going on stage. We need it to be a bit more condensed, a bit closer to one another. Or you put in captioning stage left, and then sometimes the captioning can be so small so that, oh, come on, if I'm sitting really far at the back, how do you expect me to see that captioning at the front? So there are some issues there as well. I remember when I went to Japan and I was watching a Japanese play. I sat down, they gave me glasses. These glasses had subtitles kind of built in. So I was reading captioning and looking through the glasses at the play at the same time. So where my eye gaze was, I had the captioning just below. It's a shame that obviously it was in a Japanese language, so I couldn't understand what was being said. But it's just fantastic that wherever I moved, the captioning followed. And I think that is definitely something that would work within this country. And I've heard it's very expensive to provide for obviously deaf members of the audience, which is a shame. But some deaf people like it, some deaf people don't like it where captioning is concerned. And I think we can't please everyone. It's that same old story. And I think it's important to watch and enjoy the show, you know, and you want to watch and learn, don't you? We don't want you to struggle. You know, we don't want the brain to kind of be overworked. So I feel that glasses with captioning, like the Japanese example, is definitely a solution that could work. And then, and deaf should be more immersed in plays as well, rather than being reliant on an interpreter, stage left or right, to be interpreting umpteen characters on stage. So the translation, you know, it can be dangerous at times, because when people kind of take in that information and allowing their time to kind of conceptualize what's being said and put something out in what they feel, it can be dangerous at times. And I'm thinking, no, I want my own concept. I want to make my own idea of what I'm seeing. If you kind of get what I'm saying, I don't want to rely on someone else's interpretation. So that, again, is a personal view for you guys to take away. And I think the most important part is, obviously, we do need more deaf actors involved in plays to give them their opportunities, because deaf people can do it. They can communicate with anyone, really, who doesn't know sign language. It doesn't matter, really, because it's still part of having that kind of team efforts. For example, I'm Asian, and the Asian hearing community, you know, they're not deaf themselves, but they can communicate with deaf people based on, obviously, the home language and the culture that we share. You know, to be honest, I don't know these people, and I see them kind of, their car mechanics, you know, their binmen, or, you know, most Asian people can communicate because they've got their own way of communicating, gesticulation. And I find that quite interesting. And it makes me think, you know, why can't British kind of white or any form of British person start using gesticulation? And it becomes part of the norm then, doesn't it? Everyday life, and we work together. So that's it, really. I'd say that's my view. Maybe you guys might have some questions off the back of that topic. I'm more than happy for you to throw them at me. If any of you wants to ask a question, go for it. Or I can just carry on with the presentation. You know, I don't want to bore you guys to sleep.
Could I just ask Rinkoo, because I've done a little bit of work trying to make my own show accessible to the deaf and blind communities. And one thing in particular I recognised about the deaf community is the complexity of language around that. So things like the capital D and the lowercase d, and what we mean by hard of hearing, and who usually identifies as capital D, all of that stuff. I wondered if you could sort of explain that a little bit more, because rather than me stumbling through it like I'm doing just now, you will have a much better perspective on that, I guess.
DD, in my personal view, again, it's quite political. Big capital D, little d. Capital D would be the person is full-blown deaf. They themselves work at a deaf school, they communicate in BSL all the time, they're heavily involved in the deaf world, and they believe, I am deaf. So that's the capital D. Whereas the lowercase d, they really kind of consider themselves, you know, I am profoundly deaf, or, you know, I might have some kind of residual hearing, or they themselves might have been to a deaf school where, or maybe a mainstream school where a hearing school kind of had an oral kind of take on things, or a hearing school, the deaf unit, that kind of thing. So they're like lowercase d, where they label themselves, that person's a small d. But going back to the person who is kind of deaf and for strong BSL user for a long, long time, I'm a capital D, I don't use my voice. I just use sign language. So they are both different. Some people would say, obviously, the hard of hearing kind of title, they are what you put in the small d bracket. So obviously sign language itself, rich, BSL, capital D, and it is quite political recently, and there has been a bit of a debate within the community which realises it's a little bit discriminatory. Actually, you're big D, I'm little d. Is that really politically correct? So yeah, that's really it on little d, big D, hard of hearing, but capital D, like I said, strong, proficient, BSL user, and capital D isn't just sign language. They can obviously be within deaf culture, deaf identity, deaf, rich in culture, heritage, capital D. And over to you, Danielle. Thank you.
Well, any other questions anyone can think of? Can they, Danielle, can they hear you? Rinkoo's asking. Can everyone hear? Yep, yep. You can hear her. Good, good, good.
I think
okay, cool.
Philippa has a thumbs up. Is that a, oh, that's it. Okay, I can hear. Okay, sorry.
Okay. No worries, good. Well, yeah, like I said, the theatre industry, I still hugely feel that we're on a learning journey, aren't we? There's still a lot of issues, lots of things to learn, and it's, as I said, just bringing deaf artists into the performance and into the theatre space will go a long way, I think, to help solve some of these issues. And also, sometimes I think what tends to happen is that people have good intentions and bring deaf artists in, but they'll kind of, if you like, adopt a hearing story and then try and adapt that to make that work for a deaf performance. And personally, again, I'm not a huge fan of that style either. So for example, obviously Shakespeare is globally renowned, but I personally don't understand a single word of it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I couldn't learn. But if you sit there and think, well, I don't understand, it's part of hearing culture, it's your story, it's but people often say no, Shakespeare should be accessible for everybody, but sometimes it just doesn't work. We're trying to shoehorn something in, and it just sometimes doesn't always translate. This is kind of my personal opinion again, but there's, you know, everyone knows Homer Simpson, the cartoon. I'm pretty sure you know. So you could probably picture me now sat in a theatre watching a piece of Shakespeare with my Homer Simpson head on, and a bubble comes above my head saying, I just don't know, I just don't get it, I just don't understand. That's how I feel sometimes when I go to the theatre. I want to be able to enjoy a show, and sometimes I think that's also not thought about, that we try and force mainstream stories onto deaf audiences and not necessarily think about what might be suitable for a deaf audience as well. I think in Britain, I haven't had a boring life. I'd say I'd had a really interesting life, but we don't unfortunately get to share these stories within the mainstream world. So at the moment, there's huge issues of translation, people relying on interpreters and relying on translation to be able to get their work out there. But I try to tell people that's not what it's about. We just need to integrate. We need to get deaf artists in the theatre, and hopefully get some kind of equity. So yeah, that would be my one big tip, is integration. Did somebody just send something on the chat? Hold on, just something popped up.
There's a question, if you want me to read it out, from Collier. To what extent has the digital flip of arts and culture offers in the past year made things different, if at all?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think definitely. So you were thinking about theatre, not just in general, because I was thinking in general that's really helped deaf people, but for theatre, I think definitely there's probably been a benefit, because you're looking at a screen. Obviously it's a different experience watching a performance online. About Christmas, what was the play that I think it was Christmas. It was something to do with Carol, so it must have been Christmas, but I watched something online and I really actually enjoyed it. And I think part of that was because you've got a bit of a closer view. You're zooming in really to the performance when it's on a screen. So I don't know where there'd be a signed performance available online or a captioned performance online. Again, that comes back to my very original point, is how do we know about what's available? If you Google it, it doesn't necessarily always come up. So yeah, that's one difficulty, is knowing which performances are accessible in the first place. There's for cinema, there's actually a dedicated website called yourlocalcinema.com. And if you go on there, then it shows you all of the listings throughout the UK, all of the different cinemas that have subtitles and captioning available for their different showings. So as a deaf audience member, you can go and look on that website and know when to go to the cinema. I don't know, for the theatre, we seem a bit behind in that kind of perspective. Yeah, so, but yeah, definitely I would say if there's captions available digitally, then obviously that's going to have a huge benefit to deaf people, because it's on one screen, so you can see the performance and the captions are there, rather than, as I explained it, at the theatre, that you might be looking all over the place. So definitely I can see a benefit.
Could I ask, Rinkoo, so you just sort of mentioned it, and I was wondering if you could expand on that a bit, like what is the correct marketing etiquette, I guess? What is the correct way to tell you about that the show has access in mind, and also what access is available? What do you find really useful when you're looking to see a show?
Yeah, good question. I think social media for the deaf community is really the best way to get information out, I would say. So keep posting on stuff and getting things shared, and don't forget as well that not all deaf people can read English well. So if you've got a deaf person who only uses sign language, then if you could then also use a deaf person to get your message out, and they could create a little signed clip, then sharing that on social media will go a long way. There's a website that's kind of, maybe if we could establish it like a hub website, I don't know whether, like what I spoke about in the cinemas, but maybe some kind of hub websites that could advertise all of the accessible performances. That would be really great. Yeah, and I'm sure you've all experienced this in the last kind of year, with COVID restrictions. What am I allowed to do? What can't I do? And so everybody's just gone to the gov.co.uk website, haven't they? It's all the information's in one place, so everybody knows that's where you go. So basically establishing something like that would be great, so that people know, if I want to go to the theatre, if I want something to be accessible, where do I go and find this information? So I think definitely that would be helpful. Yeah, hopefully that answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Oh, Derek, you got your hand up.
Yep. My question was, I'm a composer and sound designer, and I've tried different ways of making music and sound effects more accessible, but I'd be interested in your experience, Rinkoo, of what has actually helped in terms of that experience of music and sound. I know it's slightly different for everybody, but what genuinely has worked for you?
Okay, yeah, no, good question. And I think that's a really important question as well. And I'd say music without this difference is the difference. So music with lyrics or music without lyrics should be treated probably separately. So music with lyrics, I'm thinking usually deaf people like to know feel the vibration, so to be able to have that sound up, so get the volume up so that people can feel it. And people, well, I like to listen to my music in my car. I kind of crank it up really loud. You can probably imagine how my car's just pumping. But yeah, most deaf people really just love that feeling. So that's, I'd say, is number one. That's really important. So crank up the volume. The lyrics, if there's lyrics on the song, on the music, then there's two options there. I'd say one is use captions. So people, if they want to follow along and know what the words are, they can. The second is back to the good old interpreter on the side of the stage. But remember, as I said, everybody's kind of different, and it's not everyone's preference, like it's not my personal preference to do that. But I remember one play I went to, they had some music and they represented it in a heartbeat. So it was a visual representation. So every time the beat kind of went, this heartbeat was pumping, showing on across the back of the stage. I'm trying to think, it was visual sound or visual effects or something that they used. I can't remember the actual term for it, but that was quite good. Yeah, so I don't know whether I've answered your question, but maybe trying to make it more visual would be useful. Any other questions, any thoughts anyone had? Could be about anything, just doesn't have to be, I think specific could be.
We will have a Q&A at the end as well. So maybe we could pass over to Philippa now and then we'll come back to questions afterwards, if that's all right. We'll have
no problem.
Great.
Lovely.
Hi, yeah, I'm here, ready?
There you go.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Bear with me just a moment. And if you could tell me if everyone can see that. Thanks, Lisa. Okay, so I am going to talk about the Difference Engine, which is our captioning and audio description access tool. But I want to go back a little bit first and to start, really, we're a very small but very determined theatre company based in Coventry, very proud to be based in Coventry, City of Culture 2021. You might know us from our famous whale, which travels around the country, swallowing its audiences one at a time, or two if you're shy. It's been doing that for about 12 years now. Or other parts of our outdoor portfolio, the Cricketers, which sets up a game of cricket in a wholly inappropriate space. The Queue, which considers the etiquette of queuing. You can see our socially distanced hoops here that we brought in during after the first sort of lockdown, and we're looking to develop a new show about cycling. These are all outdoor shows, but we're also really known for what we call theatre of place, so site-specific work. And I'm going to take you back to where the access journey of the company kind of really began. So here you can see some performers in a 14th century monastery which nestles under the ring road of Coventry, Whitefriars, and we had the opportunity to work in this wonderful space, this beautiful upper gallery, which was a perfect performance space, but you couldn't get to it if you couldn't walk up the stairs. There was a lift, but it was condemned, and the company was sort of, oh, this is a great place to perform, but what do we do about that? And was lucky enough to have a local authority access officer at the time who was really supportive, but also really challenging, who basically said, you're artists. If you can't come up with a creative solution, then who can? And he worked with the company to think about that. And there was a beautiful cloister downstairs as well. And to cut a long story short, through the cutting edge technology of the time, video, they were able to connect up the two spaces. Performers, when they were not in the upper gallery, would go down to the lower space. Some people chose to view it from the lower space who could get up to the upper space because they liked that more intimate experience. And by linking up these spaces, it changed the nature of the show a bit, and actually it made a better show. It made something that was really interactive and really rich. And the company loved that. That was actually really brilliant. Here's another example. This is a cattle market in Kilkenny in Ireland, which was closing, well, moving to an out of town area. This had been the hub of the town for a very long time. It was a really important thing to mark. But it soon became very clear that in terms of physical access, the only way that somebody who needed a flat access in a wheelchair or with mobility considerations, the only way they could get around that space was the way that the cattle took. Now, it would have been really inappropriate to send people in a wheelchair along the route of the cows and everyone else go some other route. So it became obvious that that was the route everybody had to take. And then it became obvious that the show needed to be about that. The audience became a herd who were cared for by the farmer and had a different experience. The show was built around that concept and became, again, a different and we think better and richer show. Derek will probably be able to fill you in on more questions around that process as he was part of that show. So that's where it kind of all began. And the company found that it was really excited by taking what was an access challenge and finding a solution for it that was creative. And it became obvious that that creative solution didn't only help the people whose access need was being considered, but actually made a richer show for everybody. So from that point on, the company began to think of access as an exciting opportunity, an opportunity to make something that would really meet the needs of lots of different people. But as the company did shows in lots of different places.
Philippa, sorry to interrupt. We're just going to swap interpreters so that you can pin them. Thank you.
But as we did shows in lots of different places, like an underground car park or promenading around the corridors of a hospital, we found it was really hard to make work accessible to deaf or hard of hearing audiences. And we found that conventional solutions such as this one, so here you can see a captioning bar, often looked really out of place. So here it's in a disused restaurant. There's a simple setup. It really dominates what is otherwise quite a discreet bit of set. And it just looked wrong. And anyway, the show was in the round, so it wasn't really very practical. And it cost about £500 for one night, which was more than most of the performers were being paid for a week. And we didn't even know if anybody was using it, partly because we'd spent all the money on that and didn't really have the money to put into promoting and ensuring that it was bringing people in to use it. So always we came up against those kinds of challenges. We also, the company played with kind of what you might call lo-fi approaches to making things accessible, whether that was for audio description or for captioning. Always trying to think, how can we do this that is right for the show? But there were always these three barriers. The cost of the conventional access solutions for a very small company with small budgets, the inappropriateness of many of those solutions for the kinds of performances and the kinds of spaces that we were working in, and the frustration that we spent all the money on bringing that kind of tech in and didn't have the resource to then really promote things and make sure that audience actually came. And then there was a light bulb moment. This is a very old iPhone. Here was something that already had images, it had text, it had sound, and people had it in their pockets. So this seemed like a really great opportunity. So why not try and harness that and use it for captioning, for audio description, and probably some really exciting creative things too. And all of that, maybe if that could be done, operated by one person at the same time, that would be brilliant. And actually, there must be creative opportunities in that. So that began a journey as some investment, small scale investment, a bit more investment here, a bit more there. And to cut a long story short, over the last 10 years, the company has been developing this from some early prototypes to slightly better prototypes to something that's a bit more robust now. We've been using the difference engine on our shows for since 2010. And we caption all performance of most of our shows. And I'll talk about the ones we don't later on. We talk about it as captions being always on. So if somebody turns up who needs the captions, they will be there. We are also working on the audio description for that. Again, I won't talk about that in depth here today, but it's not just a a captioning tool. It's a lot more than that. So this is kind of what the app looks like now. And it's available via iPhone and on Android devices. We've had various bits of funding to get it to this point, and we're looking for more to keep on developing it. So with an app, we get easier and quicker connection to it. You can see here the app's menu with guide, captions, feedback, and the about section, all color coded with icons so that they're visually easy to recognize. We're continuing to test new features, and lots of companies have helped us to do that. And we hope to do more testing in Coventry. It's been used on lots of outdoor shows, and the kinds of shows that would be very difficult to caption otherwise, shows that are in promenade, shows that are outdoor. We've had Greenwich and Docklands International Festival, Manchester International Festival. Imagineers used it in Coventry Cathedral ruins. It was used on the Great North Star event outside the Baltic and the Sage in Gateshead with an audience of 2,000 people. I'm going to show you the back end of it. This is what the operator sees. And here you've got a laptop and a router and a couple of devices showing the captions. And on the laptop, you can see what looks a bit like a spreadsheet. And you'll see that the each cell of that spreadsheet is one screen of captions. And those captions are yellow on a black background because that's good contrast. So if somebody has visual impairments or is partially sighted, that's an easier thing for them to be able to see. And it also limits light leakage when you're operating that and receiving those captions in a dark space. You don't need broadband to run it because it creates its own local area network. So you just on the phone connect to a local Wi-Fi difference engine network and receive it through that. You can receive it through the app, but you can also just log into a browser with a particular address in the address bar to reach it directly. When you're creating the captions, you do that yourself. You start with your script in Word and you edit it so that each line of captions is just one line with a paragraph mark. So it's very easy for anybody to do. I'm not in any way undermining the value of professional captioners who can do a brilliant job, but one of the things we like about it is that the creative team can do this themselves. So when you first start, you might well want to work with a captioner, but realistically, a lot of small companies like us can't afford to do that, but it is something you can do yourself. You know your show, you know when you want there to be a pause in the text, when you want to hold back the punchline, when you want to separate things out. So we always encourage the creative team to be involved in that, if not doing it themselves, certainly to be working closely with a captioner. Once you've loaded the script, which is a very simple process of sort of cut and paste, you can then operate it by pressing the down button. So it's very easy to operate. It may not be the same people who prepared the captions who run it, but you can get, we've had customer service assistants run it. I run it, I'm general manager. I'm not a performer, I'm not a techie, I'm not a director, but I understand the pace of a show and I make sure I've seen the show and I've checked the captions against it. We have had stage managers doing it. We've had associate directors, producers. It's very easy to pick up. And actually most people who use it just learn how to do it from the written instructions. The great thing is once you've got it loaded up, you can take it on your tour and you can use it whenever you need it. It's there ready for you. You don't have to find a different captioner in every town that you go to. You can see there's a couple of columns. You can add additional columns because it has a multi-channel function. So you can have another channel of captions that might be in another language. And you can also use channels for audio description, which again, I won't go into now. And one of the things we found using it on our shows is that whilst it was there to caption it in English for people who were deaf or hard of hearing, non-native English speakers found it really useful. Perhaps they understood most of it, but they'd missed some of the words, but they could read it better than they could hear it. So that was one of those serendipitous things that we didn't plan it particularly for that, but that was a real benefit. One of those things that address some access issues, you'll find it's making the show better for lots of other people as well. So even a small touring company can afford to take this. We rent out the kits at the moment. We're looking to get it as something that can be downloaded onto people's own equipment. We do have a portable version of this that runs off a Raspberry Pi and a little touch screen. We're looking to try and get that run through a tablet. So literally you'll hold one thing in your hand. It will be very easy. You'll even be able to sort of type live. I'm just going to show you on this slide. Here we are using it on our show, The Female Warrior, which is in the gardens of St John's Museum in Warwick. And we ran this from a picnic blanket. So it's really easy to use anywhere. So there's kind of no excuse. We've used it on our walking tours, Walk With Me. These are audio tours of Coventry neighbourhoods. And one of the things, we tested that out with a number of deaf users. We got feedback from them. One of the things we learned was to slow down the walk if somebody was using the difference engine, because we didn't want people who were trying to read the captions also crossing busy roads at unfortunate times. So it's you know, bearing in mind, sometimes you need to adapt that kind of timing. You can actually, Derek's actually running the sound for the audio, but somewhere in there is, we have someone running the difference engine, just running it from that touch screen. They just look like a member of the audience. And in fact, Paul's run this for us on a couple of things. Backstage at the Albany, I remember him actually sitting on the step, just thinking, oh, that caption could be slightly better. I'll just adapt it now, here where I am. So it's, you know, it's quite a, it's quite possible to make those changes as you're going around as well. Okay. Just a little bit about the features. So you preload the captions. Audio description is possible. You can do live captioning. So for post-show discussions, for more improvised work, it's a little bit more challenging unless you can sit with the laptop and do that. And you do need to be really good at typing. Ideally, you'd have a palantypist, and we're looking at connecting it to a palantypist keyboard or a stenographer's keyboard. But I have captioned our post-show discussions. I have to say 45 minutes is about my limit without making some terrible typos, but you can do that. I've mentioned the multiple channels, and there's also the opportunity for feedback. And again, it's a good way to collect feedback from people who are deaf or hard of hearing, who might have more difficulty having a conversation with you about that, but can give that feedback through the app. We're doing a lot more about increasing capacity and fundraising, putting in some things like credits and program content, and exploring creative uses, which I will talk about in a minute. Our ambition for the difference engine is about putting access at the heart of the creative process and having it owned by the creative team. And I think one of the things around that is thinking about access right from the point when you make your show. So if you make a really fantastic show that is full of dense text, you're going to find that really hard to caption or to interpret through BSL, because you haven't left enough space for that necessarily. So thinking about that at the beginning, actually with your writer and your director, helps you to think about, okay, how would we caption that right now? Oh, that actually would be really difficult. And sometimes you might have to edit down your captions, and then you have to say, well, are we really giving an equitable experience to our deaf audiences as we are to our non-hearing audiences? We did work with a company who had some very dense work in it, and they did need to, on a particular section that was very fast paced, they did need to summarize that. And also it was a slightly semi-improvised, so the same sorts of things were talked about, but sometimes in different orders. So in that case, it was not possible, except for live captioning, which they weren't able to do, to get it word for word. So what we did was say, this is quite a busy bit of text. These are the kinds of things he'll talk about, but it might be in a different order. So we were able to provide a similar experience. It wasn't identical, but it gave the key elements that the performer was talking about in that. And we're very keen for artists to use it creatively. And I'm going to mention Paul here, who has tested both the captioning and the audio description part of it for us on his tour of an almost completely imagined musical, which was really interesting. He used the audio description part of it almost as a separate character. And even on the captioning bit, there's a bit in his show, without giving too much away, where he has to skip through it, and he skipped through it on the captions as well. So he made up some imaginary captions to give the deaf users the same experience of, oh, we've got to skip forward a bit. I hope that's kind of described it effectively, Paul. It might not make too much sense for people that haven't seen the show. But there are other ways of using it creatively.
You can give spoilers, I don't care.
Yes, sorry. Only tiniest little bit there. Another artist, Dan Nicholas, has been working on a show called Eugene, which is a two-hander piece of theatre. The two characters being one that Dan plays and another that is an artificial intelligence played by the difference engine. So it's a conversation between Dan and the audience, but also with this character Eugene. And at the beginning of the show, people have to decide, they answer a question that he poses, and depending on that question, they get a slightly different experience of what Eugene says to them, because at some point Eugene becomes only available on your phone. So again, don't really give too much spoiler away of what happens with that, but it is playing around with that as an artistic contribution to his show. We're really interested in developing a community of learning, because what Dan learns from that will be really interesting for other people. What Paul learned from his experience, all of those things we want to really share and learn from it ourselves. We're trying to embed it in Coventry a lot more. And then in the following year, we're going to really kind of try and focus on festivals a bit more. And I guess we think, you know, it's pretty cheap. We rent it out pretty cheaply. And when we are looking to get it available as a download using local Wi-Fi, there'll be even less excuse for that.
Can we just pause there, Philippa? Thanks to Swap Interpreters. Thank you. Yeah, we're all good. Great. And I should apologise, I should have got a great photo here of, had a couple of commissions lately. We commissioned two artists to experiment with using the difference engine to take stories to people's doorsteps, obviously sort of coming out of the pandemic, but recognising that this is an opportunity, again, to provide something that is accessible to deaf audiences, but also to audiences who maybe can't get out of their homes for whatever reason, but is also accessible to other people. So two different shows that have happened kind of on the doorstep, and one around a guy, again, Paul was involved in this as well, so Paul's very much pushing on the access side of things. A guy who's washing his car, and what you're essentially sort of hearing is inner thinking while seeing him from a distance, but kind of seeing what he's going through. So a couple of other things I just wanted to talk about, and I don't have a slide for these, but we often have conversations with companies who are using the difference engine, who want to talk a little bit about access. And that's a really great part of our difference engine project, because as we talk about those things with people, it makes us think, oh yeah, we should do that. Or, oh, we hadn't thought of that. Or I wonder if the difference engine could do that. So that's always a really, really brilliant part of the project. We don't set rules about how people use the difference engine. If anybody has used stage checks, they have some very clear guidelines that users of stage checks have to adhere to, and we totally respect that. And in fact, we will say to people, have a look at the stage checks guidelines, because they've been doing captioning for a long time. But at the same time, we want to give freedom to the creatives to be creative. But there is good practice, you know, about not making your caption lines too long, and about what color you're doing that in, and not using italics, because that's quite difficult for people with dyslexia. So, you know, we obviously respect that and encourage people to think about those things. What we say to those companies is that what you need to be trying to do is to create an experience for your deaf and hard of hearing audiences, which is just as rich as the experience you've created for your non-hearing audiences. It might not be an identical experience, because it might be very difficult to do that. But how do you interpret, for example, Derek was talking about this, the music. How do you describe the sounds? And that can be quite hard. Derek himself finds it very difficult to describe his music. And it's always about, you don't want to put too much interpretation on it, but at the same time, you don't just want to say music plays. Is it jazz music? Is it folk music? Is it pop music? You know, and are the words important? If it's just a song playing on its own, we would always caption that. If it's a song playing in the background, and actually what's important is that there's some pop music and the characters are, you know, are just in a pub, you don't necessarily need to caption all those words, because your hearing audience is probably not focusing on those words either. But if the words of those songs are really pertinent and provide a link to a bit of dialogue afterwards, then you need to make sure that your hearing audience are hearing that, and your non-hearing audience are able to know what that link is, so that's covered in your captions. Again, with sounds, you know, if you just say a bell, you know, is it a bell that's ringing or tinkling or tolling? Those are very different descriptors. And there's always a judgment call on that. And some
captioners would perhaps put in less description than we would. And we'll always think about that. We don't want to over-interpret, because it's always part of the joy of a piece as an audience to respond to it in your way. But it's also, we want to make sure we're captioning the atmosphere or the context in which that's happening. Yeah, I've talked a little bit about, we want to make the creative team responsible. So we would always recommend that, you know, like the writer, or it could be the producer, or a director who has a role in that captioning. If it isn't, it needs to be somebody that's seen the show, that understands your pace, that knows when to hold something back. And then test that with audiences. If you can make a contact with somebody locally that could come and see that in dress rehearsal and go, what, I didn't get that. Well, that didn't ring true for me. Then you can adapt that. But even if you can't do it on a test run, see if you can talk to your audiences. That's easier to say for a small company that works in quite intimate spaces, harder in a big theatre, but we're often able to then have a conversation with the people who've used the difference engine afterwards. One of the things Rinkoo talked about was that thing about looking at different parts of the stage, and the difference engine is something that you hold in your hand. So that means you can hold it where you want to, but you still might want to think about where you sit. So somebody who is short-sighted might have a bit of difficulty changing focal point between the difference engine and what's on stage. So you need to think about where you position yourself. And I would say that for some people it might not work. And we're very upfront about that, because I don't think there's any one solution for meeting the needs of deaf and hard of hearing audiences, or audiences generally. So we've had some users who absolutely love having it on their phone. They much prefer it to having a screen at the front where they have to look from side to side, or something over the top. And there are other people that much prefer the other way of doing it. And that's fine. It's about making things available and people choosing their own way of doing that. We are looking at whether we can have some kind of gooseneck stands that can actually stand next to you, that hold it for you in the position. And obviously you can adjust it to be in the right place for you. It also means if you're in a promenade performance, an outdoor performance, that you can move around with it and take that with you. And as I said, the operator moves around as well. Another thing we've learned about is how important it is to tell people that you're doing it. And we find people who hire it from us, some of them are really brilliant about that, and they're doing it in their socials. But then sometimes you go on their website and they haven't mentioned it, or you go on the website of the venue they've gone to and they haven't mentioned it. And so that's something, you know, to really think about. Just because you caption something, don't expect people to come. If they've never been able to access this kind of work, they won't be looking for it. They won't be looking at the places where you're promoting it unless you make that effort to reach out. So using the right hashtags, linking with the local deaf club, but also recognizing that some people who might use captions don't identify as deaf and might not even acknowledge that they're hard of hearing, but still find it useful. So having signs on your show just saying that you have this available, so people who didn't know about it when they turn up can still make use of it. And we recommend having 2 or 3 devices. We have some small tablets that are just perfect size for that available, so that people can use those. Rinkoo mentioned as well about knowing where to look, and I think we really want to draw together a list of places to post about your show. Certainly stage text run a kind of what's on listing that anybody can list their show on if they're providing captions. Disability Arts Online lists events as well, so we're going to do a bit more work on that. And we have a website for the difference engine. It's something we need to develop a lot more, but again, we have a what's on within that, but we haven't done much about promoting it, so we need to do more work on that. I've talked about designing the show. You know, we had a go at, we really wanted on a recent show. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm just going to take a step back. I said we don't use it on all our shows. So the outdoor art shows that I showed you earlier, the Whale and the Oakmobile, which we didn't see, but those are both very small, intimate spaces with very small audiences. And there isn't room for the operator of a difference engine to sit in there with the very small audience. But that audience is very close to the performer. So if they can lip read, that's a very accessible thing. And we also make sure we have a written script available so that people can follow that. So in that context, the difference engine isn't necessarily the right thing to use. And then a couple of years ago, we brought back Capture, which the first show we made for the difference engine. And it's quite a complex, multi-layered show. And there are kind of two parts to it. And we found that captions worked really well for the first part, but for the second part, that was actually quite difficult to coordinate the two sets of captions because things are kind of going on at the same time. And actually, it was a more interactive part, and it was difficult for people to hold a device and do some things we were asking them to do. So we actually used some printed visual instructions and some gestures, and that was the right way to do it for that part of the show. So I suppose it's just saying, you might think you found the perfect solution, but you might find on the next show that it's not the perfect solution. And as Rinkoo said, captions aren't right for everybody. So one thing we've learned is not to say our show is accessible for deaf and hard of hearing people, but to say this show will be captioned. And that is then saying what you're providing, and people can make their own decision as to whether that meets their needs. We tried to fully integrate BSL into that show, and because of it's quite complex with different bits, we worked really hard, and we had a team of performers, deaf performer and BSL interpreter, deviser as well. We worked with people thinking about audio description and trying to balance all of those things. We went in that with the full intention of doing it, and we realized it wasn't going to work for that show. So it doesn't mean we won't try to do that on another show, but we had to find a different way of doing it. So we realized we'd need about 4 BSL interpreters a day, and budget was an issue on that, but also it was an audience of 6 people at a time, so it was quite difficult to incorporate that. So we did have some specific shows that were BSL interpreted. And one of the great things from that was that our interpreter at the end said, because we're going to do another run of it at some point, said, shall I make you a BSL trailer for this? And we were like, oh, yeah, that was something we should have thought of before. So now we've got a trailer for the show that has been BSL interpreted, which we can use in our marketing. And I would really recommend that people do that, because that can then go out in different kinds of fora and will reach people who need a BSL interpretation of it. I'm nearly finished. Yes, we're always learning. And I think the important thing is to say we're still on a journey with this. We will still learn from people and feed that back into what we do and how we work with other companies on it. We had a deaf tester of the difference engine who became deaf very suddenly, doesn't use sign language, doesn't lip read, and so has found captions really important. And they shared with us that they were using otter.ai as an app. And that was a really good way when they're having conversations with people to get things captioned for them kind of immediately. So that's something we've been looking at as a way to communicate with our deaf audiences when they arrive. Again, you might have marketed it and you might have reached people, but if when they arrive at your box office or where you're checking in, you can't communicate with them, that's not going to be a welcoming experience. So you can use apps, you can use notes on your phone, you can use a bit of pen and paper, you know, make sure there's some way of communicating with those audiences. And lastly, I wanted to say that sometimes we do find that budget makes it very difficult to do things exactly the way we want to do. There are ways of doing things a bit more cheaply, but the bottom line is it costs money. So put it in your funding applications, particularly the Arts Council. They actively want to see those things in your budget. And I think people are always like, oh, that makes it really, you know, that makes it more expensive. I know sometimes it might take you over the 15K, and that's a longer decision period. But actually, will you make a better show by including it? I think you probably will. So put it into your budget and don't worry about that. I'm going to stop there because that was quite a lot of blah, blah.
No, that was great. Thanks, Philippa. And I guess now that Arts Council's under 15 is becoming under 30, we have no excuse because we have an extra 15K to play with in our applications to make our work a bit more accessible. So I open that up as a bit of a provocation. We're going to take a quick 5-minute break now, just so that everybody can fill up their coffee cups. So if we come back at 12:48, that would be really great. Just quickly though, to say a big thank you to Danielle and Danny, who have both been BSL interpreting for us and doing a wonderful job. So thank you very much. I will see you back here at 12:48. See you then. And welcome back. We're going to now go into our Q&A sort of area. And so feel free to ask any questions by raising your virtual hands. You can raise your video hand and I will try my best to keep my eye out for you. Otherwise, you can post them in the chat and I will read them out on behalf of you. But I'm just going to get it started a little bit by picking up on something that sort of came out of both of your talks, and that was Philippa, you were saying you need to create just as rich an experience, and Rinkoo, quite a few times you mentioned the feel of the performance, and I think particularly with captions, but also sometimes with BSL, we forget about creating the humor or the emotion or the that goosebumpy feeling that we get at the theatre. We just think, oh, these are here to translate a language, and so I guess I just wanted to sort of throw that out as a bit of a very loose question as to how important creativity and emotion is to that experience, and how we as artists can take that on and do something with that. What is it that we as artists are able to do to make that rich experience or that feel of the experience?
You muted, Danielle.
Sorry, I was just on mute there. That was a really good point, Paul. Yeah, really important question. I personally feel that there's a huge gap, and people really do miss out on this. And I'm still learning too as an artist. I've been involved now in the theatre world, I'd say about 6 years, maybe, yeah, about 6 years, going from being a stand-up comedian and then into theatre. And I'm learning from other people really about how theatre works and how I can best portray my performance and get that emotion across myself. So yeah, it's a real learning curve for me too. But I've met other deaf artists, and I'd say they haven't even really been taught about how to do this. They have the training, but going really into how we portray the emotion and creating this rich experience, I don't know whether that's even taught in their professional training. So I don't know. It's, yeah. And the theatre interpreters that are available haven't perhaps had that kind of specific training either, about how to immerse themselves into the performance and really get that equitable experience for the deaf audience members. Yeah, so I think there's definitely a gap here, and there's lots of learning in every element of it. And I think another example that comes to mind is thinking about interpreters that are available. Those in the past, there was hardly any interpreters available. Now that we've got more and more interpreters available, but the problem is that the quality of them varies, and also, as I said, the training doesn't necessarily go into depth about theatre translation and how to portray the emotions. But I think it's really key, critical, that we need to think about as a community how we do that.
And can I add, one of the things we learned while testing the difference engine, and we had some testers whose first language was BSL, so we were looking for an interpreter to be there sort of before and after, to when we were welcoming them and getting feedback, and we hadn't left enough time really to book the interpreters. So, you know, you have to remember that people are booked up, and we phoned about 40 different interpreters, and it was really a learning thing for me again, that some of those were like, oh no, I don't do performance. You know, they do meetings, or they do you know, sort of supporting people in hospital visits, or they might be happy to do things online. Some didn't want to be on film, so because we were recording it. So it's about knowing that you're finding the right interpreter, those that, you know, are experienced. And I've now got a list of people that, you know, I would approach, not all of whom we've already worked with, but who people have recommended, or that we've seen doing things. And and the other thing is that people told us that they have preferred interpreters. So if there's a show at the theatre and it's this interpreter, they'll definitely go to it. But if it's that interpreter, they might not, because they prefer the style of one interpreter to another interpreter, and that other people might prefer the other interpreter. So, you know, I think we're always looking to find people, interpreters, that kind of resonate with our way of working and performing, and kind of get us, and that helps us to learn then from them, because they can say, well, if you want to do it like that, then, you know, we need to do this, and they can inform the way that we're presenting stuff as well. And I think it's about it, just, you know, asking those questions, and seeing that interpreter, when you find a really good interpreter, that's a really brilliant resource for you. And the other thing we'd like to do more of, I think, is to connect with deaf performers. So when we were making Capsule, we had a deaf performer who is a BSL user. His first language is BSL, but does use captions and is happy to do that if they need to. But we also had an interpreter working with her who is also a performer and deviser themselves, so they understood the process, and that was really, really rich for us to get different perspectives on that. And alongside that, we had we were working with people with other kind of specialisms in access. So, and I have to say, you know, that was a really challenging show to try. We were trying to make it really, really accessible. It was really hard, because in meeting one person's access needs, sometimes you're actually making it harder for somebody else. So we were really having to balance those things. But it was a, you know, quite a long process, and we had to adjust our expectations of what we would be able to do and think about that. And I wouldn't claim that we had found the perfect solution, but it's all feeding into the next thing we do that might think about, you know, what is the shape of that show that might make it more possible to incorporate all these different aspects of access.
And again, yeah, and if oh sorry Paul, if I can just add on, you've just made me think, Philippa, what you were just talking about there about how some deaf people will see an interpreter's name and think, right, I'm going to that show, or maybe not go to that show because of the interpreter. I think it's definitely down to the style of the interpreter, and yeah, it's difficult because that interpreter will maybe adapt to the style of the performance and maybe not so much, and then every deaf person also wants something different. So sometimes the interpreter will then adapt for certain deaf audience members, but then that doesn't suit the other deaf audience members. So it's a real tricky one. But then also something else that I was thinking about is bringing in deaf people into the performance. I think most people think about it and they've got really good intentions and want to bring in deaf performers or deaf artists into the show, but they haven't necessarily checked out whether their sign language is of good quality and clear, because they just assume that, oh, well, they're deaf, so they must be able to sign really well, but that's not necessarily the case. So it's worth checking that out as well. But I think slowly we're starting to see improvements, and people can tell the difference if you've got a good quality signer in front of you, as opposed to somebody who isn't necessarily using the language in the best way. So that it can be a bit annoying. Like I don't know, if it would be kind of the same as me picking a singer. I could pick anybody; they could have an awful voice, but I might think they're amazing. So it works the other way around, that people just randomly pick any old deaf person just because they're deaf and just assume they can sign. This is, again, my own personal opinion, but it does tend to happen. So it's well worth checking out that the quality of the deaf performer as well in terms of their language production. Yeah, it's because the audience are paying good money to come and watch a show, and so they want quality, and yeah, you don't want to be let down when you get there.
And I think,
oh, sorry.
Well, I was just going to respond to that and say, you know, and I think as someone that might book a signer, of course, we don't know by watching them. You know, we can see that maybe they're dynamic, and I might watch and go, oh, that was great. But of course, I don't know if that was a good interpretation. So it's that thing again about getting feedback from your audiences, and feedback from, you know, recommendations from people that know that they've had audiences that have responded well to that interpreter. And I think we don't necessarily have those networks, and I think that's something in Coventry as a city we could look at that. And if we've got I know there are some signers in and around the city, and if we know that those are signers that people respond well to, then that's a useful bit of knowledge, you know.
Great. I'm just gonna Danielle, I'm gonna let you I was gonna let you escape, just so that, because I know you've got to go at 1.
Thank you, Paul. Appreciate that.
Thank
So we'll
you
swap to
very
Danny.
Thank
no
you
problem.
very much. Cheers. So I guess just before we move on, because there are some lovely questions in the chat, I just sort of wanted to, I guess, reflect on that a little bit. And just as we were saying, it's really important in your marketing materials to put out that this will be captioned using the difference engine. When you're using a BSL interpreter, and this has been my learning over the past like 2 weeks or so, that it's really important to say this will be BSL interpreted by the sensation that is Danny Rose, in order to sort of get that message out to people who might follow Danny Rose or know what sort of style or feel that creates. So just as you'd go and see Michael McIntyre, if you like Michael McIntyre or don't like Michael McIntyre, I think it's important to remember that the BSL interpreter is part of the experience that you're paying for if you're a paying audience member. So I guess it would be really good to think about how we promote the BSL interpreters as we go forward. I'm just going to use that to go on to a point Collier asked earlier, which is very much linked to some of what we've just been talking about. But she's asked if we could hear about how those communities that most benefit from the app or from these experiences are involved, if at all, and at what stage in the process of developing or designing the show do we or should we be including those communities to make a rich experience?
Just in terms of the difference engine, certainly we had deaf people involved in the very first creation of it, giving feedback on that. And then at subsequent points, we've done some very specific testing where we've invited some deaf people who have come from different experiences, some who were deaf at birth, some who have become deaf, one who had a cochlear implant. So we kind of had a range of different responses, and we used that we wanted to particularly as well test that on our Walk With Me tours. Like, did that work on a walking tour that's an audio tour, you know? Was that a good thing to do? Was that so? It's an ongoing process. We'd like to do more of it. I think we'll always say we're not doing enough of it, because I'm not sure you can ever do enough, because of course every show is different, and therefore every use of that technology, or that, you know, the way it's incorporated will be different. One of the interesting things for us is we hire out the difference engine, and we do give ownership of the captioning to different organizations. And when we get some feedback, or if someone decides to tweet about it, they might say the difference engine was rubbish, but that might be the captions weren't very good, rather than the app and the system not working. Or it might have been the person who's running it isn't very experienced or practiced in using it, so they're a bit late with it. So that's one of the interesting things of how we can work with people to get some feedback and to improve all of those things, because I think there's the technology, there's the quality of the actual content of the captions, and then there's the running of it. There's different aspects, so all of those need some feedback, and that's something we want to do more of. I think we'll always put our hands up and say, still not enough. So, but yeah, I absolutely agree, Collier, that having people in right at the beginning to work with you on that is really important.
And Rinkoo, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that as to when communities requiring these access provisions should be included in the process.
So you mean how far throughout the process, how far at the start? That's what you mean, don't you? In terms of, let me just reiterate, you mean, you know, when you're thinking about a process or creating something, when should you think about including, for example, deaf people and their view, when they should be included? Right at the start? And what you've just said, actually, in terms of the process, obviously in rehearsal and whatnot, it's brilliant to bring a deaf person in. It's safe, really. It reduces the stress at the end of the final product as well, because you're trying to set something up. You're establishing X, Y, and Z. The access, if you think about that as an afterthought, it won't work and it will just kind of throw it all out of funk. I remember, obviously, someone told me and said that the best way is having a deaf person in right from the offset, from the start of the process, kind of as early as possible, if not earlier than that. And just get them involved. You don't leave it too late, because it will make things just kind of fall out of sync completely.
And I think a lot of people just...
And I hope that answers the question. Sorry, Paul.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people just think, oh, we'll throw an interpreter on at the end, and then we've made our show accessible to deaf people. But obviously that doesn't create a very rich experience, and they're in the spotlight in the corner of the stage, and it's not a very attractive or appealing show for a deaf audience member. So like you say, and if you're trying to be more creative with that, it would be ridiculous to then do that in the last 2 days of rehearsal, because you've then got to recraft your whole show, haven't you?
Paul, can I add?
Yeah, and the quality drops, you know, kind of off a cliff as well. And also remembering as well that, you know, motivation, obviously, has the interpreter got suffice motivation to translate it accurately and convey the play as accurately as possible? You know, when I'm looking back at school, I'm sat and watch like kind of a hearing teacher, blah, blah, blah. Then they bring in an interpreter, and I just lost interest completely of that topic. I just found my eyes wandering, because the interpreter wasn't motivated. I need them to replicate the hearing person's behavior, the intonation. And if they don't do that, my motivation is gone completely. And the interpreter's got that motivation, that energy, those theatrics, and I feel kind of connected to them. That's much better. And you get that from drafting in someone much earlier on.
Great, thanks. Philippa.
Sorry, Philippa, over to you.
Yeah, just to remember as well that if you are bringing in somebody into that process who's deaf, who needs interpretation, you need to build that into your budget. And if you're putting that into the Arts Council, you can put that into the access costs to create the work. So the access costs for your audience are part of your normal budget, but the access costs to support people who are making the work can be put in as a separate thing. So don't forget that you can do that. You might also find, you know, if you're bringing in more members of your local community to do that, you'll need to bring in an interpreter to do it. If you're bringing in someone who provides consultancy on that as part of their freelance work, you may find that they're able to have that covered through access at work provision, but you need to find that out. Don't assume that they will bring their own interpreter, but they might be able to, and that might be covered by their access at work costs. Access at work is quite a complex thing, but somebody, you know, if you're an employer, that's something you cover and work with and get that sorted out. But if somebody is working on a freelance basis, they may well have that set up for themselves. I've worked with somebody on that basis. It was quite a long process to get it sorted for them as a freelancer, but you know, talk to the person that you're bringing in and ask if that's something that is covered for them or not. But remember that you can't have one person signing for forever because it's tiring, and you need to make provision for that as well.
Yeah, Rinkoo just wants to add just something a little on that, Philippa, you've hit the nail on the head. Exactly right in terms of how you can work through these loopholes in terms of access budgets. And so remember, when you bring in an interpreter, obviously, and who is needed, what do you mean? And remember who needs the interpreter. You know, is it you? You know, is it for you, or is it for us as the deaf community as well? So have that at the forefront. And, you know, because I'm happy to talk to kind of anyone, but obviously you can't communicate with me, or maybe you choose not to communicate with us because you're relying on the interpreter, and without the interpreter you can't communicate with us. So that's obviously how this can implicate our working relationship at times. My strategy of working really is I try and keep the interpreter out as best I can, and then me and you will work as best we can. And right at the end, you will then understand and realize that, oh, it's actually not that hard. With me as a case study anyway, it's just linked to the attitude of Britons, really. Some people just say, I can't work with deaf people. I don't know why. It just seems to be a well-established kind of thing that seems to be going on. But if you go to America, you go to Cuba, India, there's no problem with hearing people communicating with deaf people. They make the effort. You know, so I don't understand why that seems to be a British issue. It just seems to be their attitude. But, you know, if we want to make sure things are clear in terms of our show, having that access, of course, we'll bring in an interpreter, but I'm talking about rehearsals in the background, trying to work together, try not to always go to, right, we need an interpreter, try and just gesticulate, try and work with deaf people. And in the end, you develop that kind of ornate skill that you already had, and you can just communicate with the deaf person.
Fab, thanks. Gloria, I have seen your message. I'm just going to go to Derek's point though, because it's very directly linked to this, and then I'll come to yours next. So Derek's put in the chat, might an appropriate costume decision for the onstage signer by the designer be a good first step in integration? And he's put in brackets, rather than all black looking like a stage manager. I guess the one's for Rinkoo.
Yeah, like I said, like everyone's got a preference, haven't they? Most interpreters do wear black, like Danny's wearing now. You know, everyone's got a different preference, but for Rinkoo, it's for me, it's BS. You know, interpreters can wear nice, clean colors, nothing too completely distracting, but you know, as long as you can still see that contrast of the hands on the shirts or whatever you're wearing. If you want to be specific, obviously interpreters do wear black. Some interpreters might wear, I'm just trying to think of Envision interpreters that I've watched. My mind evades me. It's not important for me, really, but it is for some people. You know, as professionals, maybe I completely understand that you have sometimes things to adhere to, but for Rinkoo, he's saying that it's not for him.
Fab. Great. So Gloria's question, she has written in the chat, question to Rinkoo. You made a good point about working with an interpreter the whole day and having to rely on an interpreter again when relaxing at the theatre. Do you think having specialisation of interpreters like they do in other countries, for example, America, would be more useful? And if so, how can we encourage more interpreters to think about branching more into this domain? So Gloria, what just for everyone else, what do you mean by specialization of interpreters? Is that as in a theatre interpreter, or?
Yeah. So in America, they once they finish their interpreting training, they go ahead and specialize, so that you have medical interpreters, legal interpreters, theatre interpreter, performances, office interpreters, and just general, maybe educational interpreters. But here in the UK, the population of the interpreters are not great. They're very small compared to the number of BSL users in the UK. But for somebody like myself who's more comfortable in a lot of other domains and sort of shies away from the performance interpreting, do you think, like, if you had specializations, then you'd have one interpreter for work, and then, you know, when you go to the theatre, you have a group of interpreters that will be sort of swapping around, and they know their arts, they're artists themselves, maybe they're creatives. Would that change the experience for someone in the deaf community like yourself?
I think it's that motivation point that I'm going to go back to is key. Interpreters, if they have that motivation to kind of replicate that good translation, maybe that interpreter, they themselves, is interested in the content and saying that they could learn something, watch and listen from the play itself. I think number one for me is motivation. And sign language, you know, all sign languages have different levels of kind of understanding. Like I said a little bit earlier, you know, you've got that one conception of translation. So you hear it, you feel it, you translate it, you conceptualize it individually, don't you? So obviously you've got that intonation, which is key as well. It's such a vast array to think about. Obviously, you've got interpreters within the theatre domain, but to make sure those interpreters have the motivation for whatever the theme of the play is they're interpreting, maybe you should focus on that. You know, you're going to cover this area because you've got that motivation to learn about that area, that kind of thing, maybe. But for me, myself, obviously, you know, I've translated for ITV for all sorts of programmes within Britain. And some things that they've given me are really, really boring. Like gardening programmes, like, come on, you know, it's really boring, you know, but tough, you know, do it. So, you know, you take it on the chin. The translation was okay. But when they gave me something that was maybe kind of a police kind of car chase, crime, drama, wow. There comes my motivation. There comes my kind of artistry that gets drawn out because I've got that motivation to translate it as best I can. And it's the same with theatre, isn't it? You know, you bring someone in, and if this person, you know, is okay, you lose that motivation. You know, they influence us as the audience, and we just kind of, like I said, eyes wandering. So yeah, it is definitely good to have that specialisation. Well, but you know, I hope that kind of answers your point, Gloria. And Gloria just said, yeah, that's clear. Thank you.
Fab. Does anyone else have any questions? I've got several more, but if anybody else has any questions, then please do jump in. Philippa, was that hand up?
It was an old hand, but I have something to say to add to what Rinkoo just said. I think, like any aspect of the creative process, as you work with different collaborators, you learn to work with each other, and you know, it becomes more than the sum of the parts. And sometimes you work with somebody, whether this is an interpreter or anybody else, and that doesn't happen, and then you don't tend to work with them again. But sometimes you work with someone and it's magic, and then you'll want to work with them again because you want to recreate that or create new magic. And so I think the more we do it, the more we know who we work with. But of course, we do still need to get that feedback from audiences, because it might feel like magic to us, but does it result in a magical piece of creative work for that non-hearing person, that deaf person or harder hearing person? So, but I just think, you know, it's about relationships, isn't it? And motivation. And if we're not, we need to be talking from what Rinkoo's just said. I realize that when we're looking for an interpreter, you know, we give more time to do it so that we can actually talk to someone and say, this is kind of our process and this is what the show is about. Does that interest you? You know, is that your kind of thing? Because if it's not, I realize now from what Rinkoo said, then we need to find somebody else who will be excited by it. And I think, you know, we do work with one particular interpreter when we can, but we need to find more for when they're not available, so that we know that we've got somebody that will respond to our kind of work in a way that will share what we want to share with the audience.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Philippa, as well, sometimes you get an interpreter that is motivated by the play, but can get quite nervous and kind of unsure. What you can then do is book a BSL consultant, which is usually a deaf person, to come along that can kind of polish up the interpreter's interpretation and just give that confidence that they need as well. I myself am kind of like a sign language drama kind of guru. No, sorry. Again. Drama. T-U-R. What's it? Sorry, and the interpreter doesn't know what a terg is. It's just so it's it's an acronym. Okay, thank you. It's an acronym. Okay. So obviously, I'm a sign language drama researcher, which means as a character, it's much more than just the characters. Obviously, is the character old? Are they young? Are they Liverpudlian? Are they white? Are they Asian? Are they black? So many different factors that need to be considered. And the problem is obviously the interpreter that thinks, obviously, yeah, I can sound like that. But you need to think more out of the box. Kind of, you need to think more objectively and think about how that can benefit one's interpretation and motivation. And it's important to have like a pilot as well. Don't try and keep the same interpreter. We don't want it to be like a robotic process. You know, you want to work with them, work on their skills and work with the variety of interpreters as well. And that should work.
Great. I was just going to write in the chat, but now that we're here, Derek, what do you want me to say about Car Wash?
Just what it involved, I think. So there are pictures here which I'll move away from.
And I guess what you said, if I were to elucidate, what do you want me to elucidate?
I think just, sorry, go on, Dave.
You carry on, Philippa.
Just a little bit about the concept of the show. So Paul was directing this show, which was written by another artist. Neither Des or I actually got to see the show, so I could talk about it, but you'll do it better, I think, Paul. Just to describe kind of how the difference engine was used in this.
Sure. Yeah, and I guess to sort of prelude this, so in my show, which I tried to make as accessible as possible in 2019, I didn't work with a BSL interpreter. I worked with audio description through the difference engine and captioning through the difference engine. And we had a deaf focus group that came in to experience that. And their overwhelming feeling was we really enjoyed the capital D deaf, that being. They really enjoyed the show, but they felt like they were missing a lot because they couldn't take in the screen and the visuals of what I was creating quick enough, because it's quite a fast-paced show. And so I used, so really I keep dreaming up what the BSL interpreted version was, because at the time I was like, this show is all about isolation, and so it doesn't work with having another person on stage. It's a show called We've Got Each Other, and it's about me and the audience having each other. But actually, since then, I've been dreaming up another version in which actually there are two people, and as much as we've got each other, me and the interpreter have got each other. So I think there's a way of like reshaping that and making it a spectacle. But the audio description, I felt like I really creatively played with, and it was another character in your head that not only told you what you were seeing, but also undermined what I was saying and was like, oh, here he goes again. Look at him, just sat there on his chair, lazy bugger, that sort of stuff. And it created like a joyous thing, which I'd encourage people that were fully sighted to also listen to, because it enhanced the show even further. I felt like I didn't do that so well with captioning. There was a bit which Philippa mentioned in which partway through the show I go, oh, this is actually a 2 hour and 35 minute show, and the venue's only given me an hour, so we've got to cut through loads of scenes, and in the show loads of lights flash, and it's as though we've missed all of these scenes. And as Philippa said, I cut through the captions, and so there was loads of lines that flashed through of Tommy and Gina saying different things at different points. And so that was a fun moment for those who had the caption in. But elsewhere, externally to that, it was very functional, and it just translated what was being said, which is really quite boring to look at. So Talking Birds had sort of created these commissions for other writers to be a bit more experimental with what the difference engine and captioning is able to do. And so Kate Webster created this show called Car Wash, and it was a car that drove up to a street in which a guy gets out, and the difference engine essentially lets you read thoughts in his head. It was the sort of concept, and it's a show that deals with mental health, but in sort of a joyous way, and it feels quite cathartic by the end. But it was one of them things where it was that was the thing from the beginning, so it became like a really creative thing, and the whole audience needed those captions because that was the experience of the show, and that was part of the show. I understand that as an artist that won't work for every show, but for this show it did, and it felt like there were songs in the background coming out of the radio, and we caught little elements of that song, but really everybody relied upon seeing those captions, and that was part of the experience that we were creating. Philippa, you have your hand up. I don't know if you want it.
Yeah, two things. I'm going to come back to that BSL focus group in a minute, but just in response to that, and thinking about the difference engine, and thinking that if what you actually need is BSL, that's going to be a different thing. One of the things we have thought about for the future of the difference engine, because it can potentially also do images and video, that maybe we can get some kind of BSL video aspect, but whether that would really work or not, we don't know. It's something to experiment and play with and get feedback on. And when we tested on the Walk With Me audio tours with a number of different of deaf people with different slightly different needs, first of all, it's like, let's walk a bit more slowly, but also feedback from some of those people was that they didn't need as much text as we put in. So that was when it really flagged up for me. I should totally know it's a different language, so it's it wasn't necessarily, and the syntax of BSL is different to the syntax of spoken English, but also as Rinkoo mentioned, that some people who grown up using BSL as their first and maybe only language won't necessarily read text. So we had some discussion around whether some visual elements might be helpful, and how that would be. Or some people said, actually, I'd just like a shorter version of the text, a sort of abridged version, but that's not something we would feel we could create on our own. We'd need to work with people, and I'm sure that would meet some people's needs, and it would not meet some other people's needs. Because we have multiple channels, we could be providing 2 or 3 different versions of it. So that's something for the future for us to look at and play with and experiment. And then to come back to Paul's BSL focus group, was it the one in Birmingham you were talking about, Paul?
Yeah.
So Paul was really kind when he said that, he didn't really mention that actually they hated the difference engine. They really hated it. And this was a really learning point. And that's because they didn't really want captions. They were BSL, people whose first language was BSL, and they wanted BSL. And they'd been invited through the theatre and through someone else to be a focus group. And actually, they should never have been a focus group for it, because it wasn't really meeting their needs. So that taught me that I needed to be more in control of the testing. We'd given it to Paul, and he was testing, and he was doing a lot of that work, but actually we should have had more of a role in that. And, from a brief that Paul could then take to to the venues to say, these are the kinds of people we need to test it, because we were testing it with the wrong people. So they rightly hated it.
And I think it was a big learning curve for the marketing manager that was working on the show, was that that was the moment where we realized that we shouldn't have been going to deaf communities and saying, this is accessible to you. And that was the moment where we went, oh no, actually, the way in which we get this across to people is that this is being captioned using the difference engine.
And it was a really good learning point, not only from that, but we ended up having another discussion with them and really understanding what they can. And actually, they were really, the reason they hated it was because they knew that this was a cheap option, and they were worried that people would stop doing BSL and would do this because it was cheaper. So actually, when we got to the root of the issue, that was really helpful. And I always now make sure when people hire the difference engine, I say, but this won't meet the needs of people who want BSL. It's not a replacement. So I think it's about acknowledging that and being very clear that, you know, just because you're captioning something, you're not meeting the needs of everybody who's deaf.
This conversation could go on and on and on, and I would sit here for hours more, but unfortunately we are coming to up to 1:30, and I'm very aware that Danny's hands must be killing right now, because he's been on for the last half an hour. But I just want to say a really big thank you to Rinkoo and Philippa, both for your presentations. I want to say a big thank you to Daniel and Danny and Sarah. You didn't get your moment to shine, but I'm sure you would be wonderful. Just to say that next week our session is on, let me just double check I get the right week. My head's all over the place. Audiences from lower economic backgrounds. So a very different sort of access requirement next week, but we'll be joined by Studio 3 Arts and Imagineer Productions, which will be fab. So that you can sign on through the Shoot Festival or City of Culture website, access Coventry. These videos will also be published, recorded, so I will make sure to put any links as well in the YouTube box below that. So Rinkoo, it would be great to have that cinema website for people to look at as an example. I'll put any of the other links that.
Yeah, so it's sorry, just to interject there, it's called yourlocalcinema.com.
Great.
FYI, and just have a look how that works.
Fab. Lovely. Thank you all so much, and thank you for joining us today, and thank you, Lisa, for being our technical wizard. I shall hopefully see you next week.